Music Industry Studies Assignment 2. You'll open JPEG 1 to see what you're required to do. Halfway down that JPEG 1, you'll see ASG2, which means Assignment 2. Write an essay of a minimum of 500 words on the following topic. How do you know what the word count of any document is? You go to the bottom left-hand corner of your Word document. It'll tell you how many words you've typed at a particular point, or if you want to see how many words you've typed in anything, you just highlight the section of whatever it is you're writing in the Word document. That'll tell you the word count. So this is write a minimum of 500 words on the following. I'm going to read what's written in bold letters, and I'm going to explain anything that may not be obvious. Outline. Outline means that you don't write an absolute monster book on the assignment, but you don't write too little either, because under 500 words is too little. So outline the different stages of the process that a band goes through from composing to releasing a song. What that means is from the point an idea comes into a band member's head to the point where the musical idea is released on some streaming platform like iTunes or Spotify. How does it happen? That's what you're going to write about. Make references to the roles of the different skill professions involved throughout. For example, you might have the musician, you might have the mixing engineer, you might have the mastering engineer, you might have the studio engineer, you might have the distributor, a company like Emu Bands or Distrify or TuneCore, who will put your music up on all these streaming platforms. That's what it means by making reference to the roles of the different skill professions involved throughout, both within the band and in the music industry. That's what I just said. Okay, the next part talks about the money that you might make as a band. Identify the potential sources of income that releasing the song could generate for the composers, writers, and performers within the band. A composer, a songwriter is the same thing. A composer normally referred to in the old days where there was mainly just classical music. A songwriter is the term usually used to describe somebody who writes lyrics as well as maybe chord progressions. The first stage that a band goes through from composing to releasing a song is the composition itself. That's self-explanatory. The song that you hear eventually from the internet or from your television or video game is the composition, and all of that tells you what you need to know about that. There may be one or two people involved in the composition. For example, Lana Del Rey's first album, Born to Die, was co-written by about 4 people. You can see the credits. Anybody interested in production in general, it's a fascinating album to research, and all of that information is on the internet or on a magazine, music production magazine called Sound on Sound did a huge feature on that. So that'll explain to you the whole process and the multi-person involvement there. There was Lana Del Rey, who wrote some of the lyrics, all the lyrics, and then 3 other producers. A band can include a number of co-writers. If you take a huge band like U2, who were widely considered the biggest band in the world for at least 2 decades, all of the writing and composition credits is split between the 4 members of the band. It doesn't matter if the lyricist, the singer, wrote all the lyrics. It doesn't matter if the guitarist wrote most of the music. Everybody gets a co-credit, equal co-credit. So these are things to be aware of. So you can read the rest yourselves about composition. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. As I said, I'm going to try and go through this quickly. We'll open JPEG 2, please. In JPEG 2, it talks about the arrangement. An arrangement of a song, you can read that yourself. It's all self-explanatory. but an arrangement refers to the different parts. You could have an intro, verse 1, chorus 1, verse 2, chorus 2, bridge, outro. That's the most standard format. But different songs can contain different ways of writing. When you get in depth into songs arrangements, you'll see things written like A, B, A, or A, B, A, B. That might be verse, chorus, or there are different ways songs be written. There's some students who are recently talking about Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan will have perhaps what's known as a refrain. In other words, the first line of what somebody might traditionally call a verse is the actual chorus, but it's not a chorus, it's called a refrain. So a refrain is any section that repeats itself in any work of art. That work of art could be a play, it could be a script. You take a song like The Times They Are A-Changing, which is just one line at the end of a whole load of other lines, so that would be considered a refrain. A refrain is anything that repeats itself, but it's not a 3 or 4 line chorus. These are things you learn about in an arrangement, advanced stuff which is beyond this course. So a demo recording, folks, is something that record companies used to demand, and they still do to a point, but not as much. A demo recording was a demonstration recording that you did quickly with, say, a small little studio to give the record company an idea of the potential of a particular song or music. Nowadays, with bands and solo artists and dance producers having their own equipment, and the technology is very, very advanced now. A lot of bands have their own setups and recording, but particularly pop songs and dance music, a lot of that need for a demo does not exist anymore, because you take an artist like Hozier with his song Take Me to Church, that vocal was recorded in his attic. So the vocal you hear, and it became famous all over the world, is the recording he made that he supplied to the record company. And he even had parts added in his own loft. And then it was brought to the record company. The record company suggested re-recording it, realized that the commercial recording that they did in the big studio wasn't as good as his original so-called demo recording version. The reason I know about that is because, again, there's production articles available on all these massive songs, and mainly through a magazine called Sound on Sound. Pre-production is all the work you do before you go to the studio. Pre-production might be, we decide on the key, we decide on the tempo, we decide on the parts, we decide on your arrangement. It's everything you can do before you reach the studio. That's extremely important because you save yourself a fortune. Studio time for a massive band is very expensive. It can be between 1,000 to 2,500 euros or dollars a day. So you don't want to be dicking around in the studio doing all the work you could have done before you reach the studio. That's fine for massive bands like Coldplay or U2 or Metallica, who money is no object to them and the record company is paying anyway. But every other band, you've got to be conscious of the cost of a studio. Rehearsal, you can do all of that before you reach the studio. That's the next point. The vital stages between composition and releasing a piece of music. Don't forget, that's the question. Now, the recording itself, that requires in-depth knowledge by the artists or a studio engineer. So you see, recording says, at this stage the artist band enters the studio with a producer and engineer to lay down the recording of the track. Nowadays, a lot of members of bands are very, very tech savvy, as they say. They know the way around a studio because a lot of them have, as I said, equipment at home. So they would be, even nowadays, co-engineering. But then there are a lot of artists that know nothing about the engineering side and need an engineer to do all of that. So it says there, some artist bands may choose to rent a high-end studio at great expense. You would have to be a signed artist, in other words, an artist that has a record deal with the company who will pay for all of that. Local band here, the Blizzards, they recorded in Grouse Lodge, which is in Mold, Rosemount, and it's very, very expensive. So the record company is paying for that, but ultimately the artist is paying for it because they're paying it. It's a loan that's given to the band. It's called a recuperable advance. So it's advance money that a band is given on hopefully the sales of the recording. It's called a recuperable. Recuperable means to get something back. This record company want to get their money back. Why am I talking about that? Because it's the record company who pays for the big high-end studio. Now it says the style of recording largely depends on the style of the song. What does that mean? A dance act, the likes of Noel Edwards or somebody like that, any dance acts I apologise about. I only know really dance music from the late 90s. Bands like The Prodigy, Groove Armada, Chemical Brothers, Leftfield, they would have done most of the arrangement and the recording of the tracks themselves in their own tiny little studios, because that's the nature of dance music. You can do an awful lot of it on your computer because a lot of it is sampling, chopping up audio, and that doesn't take a studio to do live recordings. But if you're a rock band or a band like Coldplay, you need really high-end studio to record multiple instruments, possibly playing at the same time or doing overdubs, which is recording a track on top of another pre-recorded track. That's where you need the high-end studios. So the reason I'm talking about that is the style of recording largely depends on the style of the song or the style of the act's music. Now the next part there is simply saying that you have sample libraries available now. So a lot of the time when you hear strings, what I mean by strings, violins, double basses, cello, violas, all of that, that is done by using sample packs. I'll go back to the earlier example I mentioned, Lana Del Rey. That first album, Born to Die, is a standout for its strings. All those strings you're hearing are from a sample pack. For example, IK Multimedia Miroslav Orchestra. That's the exact sample library that is used on that album. I know that because I did the research and I read the article and I ended up buying the same sample pack myself. In other words, there was no violinist in any studio, there was no cellist in any studio that played those parts. Those parts were played via a keyboard that activated samples on a computer. And listen to that album, Born to Die, Lana Del Rey, to hear that in action. We'll move on to JPEG 3. It talks about editing. Editing is something you really need experience in a DAW, digital audio workstation, also known as multitrack editing recording software. So everything that a multitrack editing piece of software can do, that's called editing. You can chop up audio, you can time stretch it, you can pitch shift it, you can cut and paste, copy parts to other. All of that is referred to as the editing, and a large part of that will be part of the arrangement as well. Mixing is something that's done to get relative levels correct. In other words, you might want to get the kick drum volume right relative to the bass guitar. You might want to get the vocal level right relative to the rest of the music. A lot of people starting off don't mix the volume, they don't put the volume of the lead vocal high enough. Now, mixing is not just adjusting the relative volumes of each instrument. It also involves processes like equalization, compression, limiting, panning. These are all things that you have learned or will learn in your sound engineering module. So mixing, as I said, is not just getting volume levels right of instruments relative to each other. The next stage of a composition from a band, from their composition, in other words, when the idea comes into their head to the point they release it, is the mastering stage. The mastering stage is a last stage done to a piece of music before the piece of music is released, before you give your piece of music to one of those distributors like I mentioned earlier. TuneCore is one of the biggest ones, Distrify is the next biggest one, and a crowd called Emu Bands, which is one I release my own music on, and Noah Edwards releases his own music through. They put your music on Spotify, iTunes, all of those massive YouTube Music, all of those massive Google Music, Amazon Play, all of those. That's what a distributor does. So the mastering is what you need to do before your music is released on those platforms. And mastering is normally done by a person called a mastering engineer. There is one here locally in the Midlands. He's based out there in Russellstown, and he has an incredible setup, tens and tens of thousands of euros worth of equipment. So that's all he does all day, every day, is he masters people's music. And that's where you get things right, like the overall volume of the final piece of music has to be the same as the overall volume of any other commercial piece of music that you're listening to. It's called loudness maximization. That's the most important part of the mastering process, and that's done with a process called limiting, a limiter, and that limiter can either be hardware or software. If you haven't learned about that already, you will do in your sound engineering. There are other processes that happen in mastering. You might equalize the overall mix, you might compress the overall mix a little bit, and you might do a thing called stereo widening or spectral enhancement or tone enhancement. These are all little icings on the cake. So that's mastering, the last stage. We go on to JPEG 4. There's a process there called duplication. This, what you're reading, was written in 2013. That is an age ago. That's 12 years ago as we speak. So 12 years in the music industry is a huge amount of time, because the music production is massively influenced by technology, and the technology in 12 years has changed the way music is making. So duplication is not as relevant now. It's barely relevant. Many years ago, say 20 years ago, the only way you'd hear music is on compact disc, CD, or before that was cassette, before that was vinyl, before that was gramophones, and so on. So the main way you listen to music now is you stream it from the internet via Wi-Fi or whatever. But duplication applies to vinyls. So say a band want a specialist run of records, vinyl records, then that original master has to be duplicated. Duplication means to copy something, repeat it. But nowadays bands don't release compact discs because nobody has compact disc players. Moving on to distribution, I talked about that earlier. It mentions everything I just mentioned there. The main distributors. To get your music on, people often ask, how do I get my music onto Spotify? You can't approach Spotify, you cannot approach YouTube Music, you cannot approach Amazon Music or Google Music directly. You go to an agent, and that agent is the distributor. Then they go, say for example TuneCore Company, then TuneCore will approach iTunes, Spotify, Amazon and so on, and you will pay the distributor, the TuneCores of the world, the Distrifys, the Emu Bands of the world. You pay them a fee and they will put your music on all of those platforms. Surprisingly cheap. From memory, I just released the 4th album there, and I did it through Emu Bands, and that only cost me about 29 euros to put a 9-song album on all of those platforms. So it's not as expensive as you think, and that means that your album is on those platforms forever. Now we will go down to the bottom of JPEG 4, a press pack. There's a thing called an EPK, which you're going to be doing later on in your project in music and industry studies. EPK is an electronic press pack. In the old days, you'd have to send physical medium to these companies. You'd have to provide a compact disc of your music. You'd have to have maybe a memory stick with a lot of photographs, a lot of artwork of your band's image. But nowadays you can do all of that via an email, one email that can, and in that one email you'll provide an EPK electronic press pack which will include links to the band's music, links to the band's artwork, links to the band's social media. You just, for whoever the record company or the radio DJ or the promoter, just wants to open one file, which will be your electronic press pack, which, like I said, will contain all the details about the band, contact details, artwork, in other words photographs, maybe a logo of the band that they can use. And I know all this from personal experience. A local paper like the Westmeath Examiner or the Westmeath Topic will want a photograph. They'll want details about you. Where can we hear the music? So you want to give all your social media links. And say you're not on Spotify yet, but you're on SoundCloud. You want to give your SoundCloud links to your music. Let's open the final JPEG 5 promotional campaign. Again, what was the question? What does a band need to do between composition and releasing your music? You need a promotional campaign, and that's done mainly via the internet now, via social media, Instagram, in the old days Facebook, or whatever else you guys use of your generation. Now, if you're playing live gigs, it does help to get local radio stations. Again, a lot of these are what's been referred to now as legacy media. So mainstream media is actually, by virtue of pure numbers, is legacy media. It's fading out. So you guys have new different platforms for distributing things. You use those, TikTok in particular, at the moment. Will that be around forever? Who knows? At the time of speaking, it's January 2025. There was talk about America banning TikTok. They didn't do it, but you see the point I'm making. So new media are going to evolve, and they're the ones you need to use to promote your music. Music, airplay, monitoring. Okay. You got to get your music on whatever platforms people listen to. Nowadays, people seem to explode through TikTok. Get heard, whatever it takes. Nowadays, it seems to be the more outrageous and outlandish the thing you do in the video, the more attention you'll get. But that's all fine. The music still has to be brilliant. Okay, touring nowadays, because people do not make money from the sales of any physical objects. Like I said, in the old days, they made a lot of money through the sales of compact discs or vinyl. You don't do that anymore, because the money you get from streaming is not worth talking about. In other words, Spotify, what it pays its artists, is disgraceful by all accounts. Not my opinion. Everybody says it. The biggest artists in the world, some of them feel so strongly about it that they boycott Spotify and refuse to put their music on Spotify. That's globalization for you, folks, right there. At one or two companies owning everything, they get everything, and 99% of people get nothing. If you don't believe me, I'll give you one stat that I always remember. There was a band called Portishead in the late 90s. They had 2 million or 10 million, anyway, millions and millions of streams of one of their albums, and they got £2,000 sterling to split between the band for millions of plays. So you're not going to get rich, folks, out of having your music streamed on Spotify. Now, potential income sources, you can see 4 of those are listed there. Performance royalties, they're things you need to register with a Performance Royalty Collection Society in Ireland. You've written about it already. It's called IMRO, IMRO, Irish Music Rights Organisation. That's what they do. Any artist that has original music that uploads their stuff on any of those streaming platforms or has had their music played on radio, you get paid some money every time your music is streamed or played. Now, mechanical royalties, that refers to the sale of physical objects. Was relevant many, many years ago, not so relevant now, because, as I said, physical objects other than vinyl are not a thing anymore. But you do get live performance royalties as well, folks. When you register with an organisation like Irish Music Rights Organisation, about 3 times a year they will ask you to list or to state your live performances, and you actually get paid a little amount of payment on top of the actual performance fee you get from the venue or from collection of money at the door that you organise. And the last thing is potential income sources, music placement. If you have your music played in an advertisement, in a video game, if it's a theme tune on television, any of those things, or a movie, you get quite a bit of money. Say, for example, you compose music for an advertisement like Vodafone. I remember there was an American band called The National, and their music was used in it. So a massive conglomerate organization like Vodafone, they would get tens of thousands of euros because their music was played there.